Well, hello, friends. Welcome back. Um,
Hi.
Hi, it's good to see you. This is our last programming for our virtual tricorder. I'm really glad to see everybody, and yeah, it's nice. Hopefully, we'll be able to see each other in person next year. Thank you so much for being here, Melinda, and thank you guys for coming. I will let you introduce yourself. How about that?
All right. Thanks, Josh. Well, welcome, friends. I just want to say hello. In particular, we have a friend from New York yearly meeting who has joined us, Arlene Johnson from Chatham Summit meeting. The other part of New Jersey. So this is a tricorder. It's three quarters in southern New Jersey, Arlene, who gather. And I used to joke around that New York, when I served New York yearly meeting, I used to joke around that New York and Philadelphia yearly meetings had joint custody of New Jersey. Um, and New England and New York had joint custody of Connecticut. So very nice to have another New Jersey friend here from our neighboring yearly meeting. And it's great to see friends from Tricorder. Thanks for coming tonight. Um, so I am Melinda Wenner Bradley, and I serve the yearly meeting, Philadelphia yearly meeting, as the Youth Religious Life Coordinator. Um, so I serve all of you, and very happily am in a role where this position is meant to hold kind of two pieces of work that connect. One is the PYM youth programs, are programs that are yearly meeting wide programs like Middle School Friends and Young Friends for the high schoolers, and the Children and Families program for kids who are fifth graders and younger and their families together. And we're really hoping to be able to have some family overnights this year. But again, we'll see. As Josh said, there's just a lot of, seeing how things go. And then also support for our local meetings. And that's a piece of the work that I really love very much is supporting formation, religious education programs, what's happening in our local meetings. Um, and there is a bridge there, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that bridge tonight, and um, the connection between what happens in our local meetings and the wider yearly meeting family. I chuckled this past summer at annual sessions. People were very taken with the idea of referring to our PYM family. I was like, we've been calling it that for a long time in the youth programs world. That's not new for us, the idea of holding our body as a family. So, all together now. All together now is for me shorthand. It's a little shorthand phrase for the statement that was part of the description for our gathering this evening. And here's the longer phrase that creating all ages community is vital to the future of the Religious Society of Friends. That creating all ages community is vital to our future. Um, the artwork here, it was done by a young friend at Sessions a couple of years ago. Jacob Hoops. If you know Tom Hoops at George School, his son Jacob drew this. This was he sketched it while we were gathered as a body for worship, and you can kind of see there that there were quilts on the floor, and there were younger children and adults sitting with them. This was the sessions where we walked back into the room one afternoon for a plenary, and we found that the high school young friends were sitting at the clerk's table. And it wasn't really a joke or a coup on their part, but they were fully expecting to be asked to step away from the clerk's table. And there was some surprise when the general secretary, when Christy Duncan Tesmer actually asked them if they would hold the space in worship until we began whatever the program was that was happening next. And they did. And they sat there at the clerk's table, our high school youth, and really held us as we began our work that afternoon. And the phrase that rose in me as I watched them sitting there was that they are part of the now of Quakerism, our young people. They're not just the future, they are also the now. So the big kids up at the table, the little ones sitting on the quilt. And it really asks, then we need to ask, how do we invite more people to be in this space with us together, to be all together now. So in the time together tonight, I'm going to talk about invitation and welcome and inclusion. We'll talk a little bit about signs and schedules and spaces, which is some of the nitty gritty and nuts and bolts. And then think a little bit about rethinking some of our practices and structures. And I want to offer you a vision this evening, and it's a vision that may be kind of way out there for some folks. It may feel radical and too much in some ways. So the invitation is to consider that this is a continuum. And wherever you are now on the continuum, you or your meeting, and then what I'm suggesting is the place that we could go. Your work is just to think about where could you go next coming out of this presentation. So maybe there's some stretching involved, or maybe you're ready to take a couple steps in the direction, and this is the encouragement and accompaniment you need. And of course, I serve you, so I am here for encouragement and accompaniment after this evening too. And we have many other gifted folks in our yearly meeting to be that accompaniment with each other. So in the last 10 years, I have visited and worked widely among friends in the United States, as well as traveling in other parts of the world where Quakers live, England, Peru, Kenya. And I have a ministry that is really about sharing and collaborating on religious education. But there's always been this twin theme of outreach. And at the intersection are families and their children. And I often hear these questions: how do we attract more families, more young people? How do we grow? And the numbers of children and families in meetings, and there are of course exceptions, it has been declining across the United States. And in my work in both Philadelphia and New York yearly meetings, it is often most apparent when we gather as a yearly meeting body. Children and young people are not there in the same numbers. And I think the thing that's important to hear is that they're not there in the same numbers as they might have once been because their parents are not there. Children don't drive themselves places. I have 2 teenagers who now do drive. It's the most terrifying part of my life. But generally, children need adults to get them places, and their parents are not as much among us. We have lost some of our tether to the people who I call second thirds. A friend of mine coined that phrase one night, actually at annual sessions when families were hanging out together. She said, hey, we're second thirds. We're in the second third of life, somewhere between the end of being young adult friends and being elders in our meetings. We're somewhere between 35 and 55-ish. We're second thirds. And that group of people are the people who generally are going to have children, if people have children in our communities, as well as some young adult friends. So in generational terms, this is Gen X right now and some older millennials. And after serving a few years now in yearly meetings as a staff person with some role related to youth, I have accepted that no amount of communication or outreach from the yearly meeting or our youth programs is going to bring families into local meetings, which is why I'm here and glad that you're here this evening, because local meetings are the bridge. You are who a family will seek if they're seeking to find a spiritual home. And so when we ask that question, how do we attract more families? I actually think the question that we might think about asking is why, instead of how. Why do we seek to include families and children? Start there. Why would a family come to our meeting? What are they seeking? What do they need? What will we learn if we ask them what they need? And are we prepared to offer that? I've sometimes heard Quakers described, I think we all know that polarity that isn't really a duality of activists and mystics, and can you be both, or do you have to be one or the other? And at some point somebody said there was a third group of people who are spiritual refugees, people who come to Quakerism seeking, they're spiritual refugees from some other experience in their childhood or earlier adulthood. And I think families often fall into that category of being spiritual refugees. Parents are looking for something different from their own experience of church growing up, or they may be people who are friends lots of friends who were raised as friends become more itinerant in their, college, if that's part of their life, in their earlier 20s. And they may often come back seeking community again when they've had children. So I'd like to suggest that when a family comes to a meeting, for whatever reason, they have found themselves there at your meeting and they cross the threshold into your meeting community in your space, maybe on Zoom these days, but when we're all together again and, the way we usually do things, that there really are sort of three sets of needs that we need to think about. There are the adults who are seeking some nurture and support for their individual adult spiritual journey. They are seeking, often, I've heard people really say, well, actually, we really are looking for some kind of religious education for our children. So they're seeking some kind of spiritual home or education for their children. Some people are very specific that they really are looking for that, and others less so. They may be seeking some version of what they had in youth. And parents often say they don't feel equipped to offer this to their own children. And they're seeking a spiritual home for their family. We are a little bit disconnected in some ways in our communities these days. And so the meeting is another place to seek, three generations being able to be together, elders and other people who are support, for other families of support for, that community. So, and I say this partly because when a family shows up, a lot of times we say things like, oh, go find the first day school clerk. There's a family. But you know what? That family needs a lot of different people to wrap their arms around them, and thinking about both the children and those parents and their families' needs. And the questions on the right side of this slide are just somebody just shared this with me. I thought it was so great. It's questions to ask people other than, where do you work? Where do you go to school? How's school? Not making assumptions about people and their lifestyle or their vocational choices or where they are. It's questions like, what's something you're really into right now? What's your favorite word? What is your favorite thing to do when you have free time? Things that help kind of open up conversation. Thinking about those introductions. So backing up and thinking a little bit about that seeking, those families and parents who may be doing that seeking. This is from the work of Diana Butler Bass, an American historian of Christianity. She's an advocate of progressive Christianity. And she talks about how it used to be that the way people's formation worked and the way your sense of belonging in a faith community worked was you believed whatever it was that church believed. You learned how to behave, what to do, how to do the practices of that faith community, and therefore you belonged. She talks about how a long time ago faith was a matter of, she talks about how we actually need to flip it. And we need to flip it to belong, believe, behave, believe. That faith long ago was a matter of community first, belonging, practices second, and a deepening understanding of belief over time as part of that belonging. And that our immediate sort of ancestors in the world of Protestant Christian faiths flipped the order around. And that it's really our job to be part of the great reversal of taking it back the other way. And we think about some of the things that have been going on in our own yearly meeting, and the New York yearly meeting led the way with some around membership. How does it feel different if belong, a sense of you belong here, happens first, at the beginning of this? She talks about how Diana Butler Bass talks about the early community that followed Jesus was a community of practice. They did not sit around and listen to lectures on Christian theology that Jesus was giving. They listened to stories that taught them how to act toward one another, what to do in the world, that challenged traditional practices and rituals. And by doing things together, they began to see differently. So in the biblical pattern of faith, in the stories, believing actually comes last, and experience leads to belief. So it's about gathering and belonging first, being a beloved and beloving community, and then a way of life practiced in the world, and a profound trust in God or spirit or the divine, and mercy and justice. For friends, we would probably add peace in there as well after justice. So one of the pieces of work that I've had the privilege to do in the last few years was something called the Vital Meetings Project. There was a joint project of New England and New York Yearly Meeting. And there was staff support back and forth, and we were really looking at the experiences of young adults and then families and children in terms of being integrated into the life of local meetings. There was a lot of, I was in relationship with specific meetings who applied and were part of the project, and it was a lot of accompaniment and listening, reporting, and deciding on things to try in their meetings, and then more accompaniment. It was really about relationships and community. So here are some of the things that we learned through the Vital Meetings Project of working really intensely with local meetings who wanted to be more welcoming of people who sometimes are generationally on the margins. The importance of experimenting with time and schedules, of looking at spaces with fresh eyes, playing together and sharing meals, all ages worship, I'm going to talk about that more later, finding ways to talk and teach about unprogrammed worship across generations, developing opportunities to talk about spiritual gifts, thinking about nominating, for example, from a place of spiritual gifts more than filling roles, that one leads to the other. Inviting newcomers into participation and leadership, and finding informal ways for adults and children to connect and have exchanges around their faith and action in the world. And I'm not going to say a lot about this now, but if you're interested, at some point, hit me up for a conversation about nominating committees and this question about gifts. My meeting, Westchester meeting, did a whole restructuring of our committees in the last year that began with talking with people about what they thought their both practical and spiritual gifts were. We ended up with more people participating on committees. We ended up with a younger generation of people clerking most committees. It created a shift that was really about welcoming people in to that. And of course, COVID has impacted all of that some the way it does. And the other thing I would just say about the Vital Meetings Project, something that we learned, I think it's important to say, is that some of the work, if you're going to, change can be hard. And we found that often we were really needing to address old conflicts and wounds in a meeting community among relationships. Sometimes that was the work we needed to do first, we found. And that is brave work, and it's work that takes tender, accompaniment to do. But if we could kind of sit with that and move through some of that, it was also important to celebrate small successes. Change is slow and obviously takes time. But again, I'm glad to talk more about that project. It was a really wonderful learning. So I'm going to turn to some practical things. That's a picture of Swarthmore Hall, Margaret Fell's home in England. I just thought it was so hilarious that it was actually outside the cafe, but I just loved that, outside Margaret Fell's house, there was a little child-sized table and kid-size IKEA table and chairs. I'm looking at Emma, who I know has worked with little children. It was just so fun that was there. If I ever write a book, that's going to be the cover of the book. I just think it's so fun. So signs, spaces, and schedules, and thinking about how those things at our meetings have both spoken messages to people about who we are and are welcome, and they often have unspoken messages as well. So these are some examples of website banners. These are both examples that I redid, but they're what the words were and where they were on a couple of meeting websites. So if you look at the one across the top, and I don't think it matters that it's top to bottom and left and right, but here was a meeting that if somebody went to their website, the first thing they saw, because we go from left to right reading, was welcome. and worship, and then children and youth, learning, serving, giving, news, and events. The other one, another website, was what is a friends meeting, about us, calendar, directions, donate, witness, our first day school, which visitors won't even know what that is, our library, and links. So just take a minute to take that in, and what are the unspoken messages of that being the arrangement on a website? Of people, I'm a family with a couple of kids and I've heard about Quakers and I'm going to go to this website and see if this is something for our family. There's an unspoken message, if I know what first day school is, if it being that far down on a menu, for example. So websites often include what to expect in worship, and it's important for them to say what to expect if you come with your kids, what to expect in children or young people's programs. It can be great to invite young people, if you have them in your meeting, to be involved in the website development and include their artwork in it. Let people know there are children there. And again, links to the quarter and yearly meeting are great because you are the bridge. Local meetings are the bridge to those wider bodies, to Tri-Quarter, to the yearly meeting. And I don't want to pick on this meeting. I'm actually not even sure what meeting it is. If it's yours, I'm going to apologize now, but you don't have to tell us. I thought this was an interesting sign because somebody goes by it says something friends meeting for worship, all welcome. Maybe they don't have anything for children, but it doesn't say anything about a program for children or youth. But it also says fourth Sunday, 11 a.m. And again, just thinking about language, are people going to know what that means? And so I use it partly as an example of being careful that the language that we use is not inside outside Quakerese that people don't understand. If you'll indulge me for a moment, I would love for us all to stop using the phrase first day school. It's like blasphemy. But yes, Josh is horrified. It is charming. I mean, when I tell you that I've typed FDS so many times in my young life, that if I type capital F, my fingers go DS, like it's just instinctual. It's true. But when a visitor comes to meeting and we start to talk to them about our children's program and we start to explain first day school and the lovely story of the historic reason why we use that language and not Sunday school, I hate to tell you this, but they really don't care. Most of the time they are like glazing over. They're not. It's really interesting to us as friends. It may be less interesting to them. So the possibilities of rethinking what we might call that. I worked with one of the meetings in the Vital Meetings Project who they were seriously thinking about changing their sign to say Sunday school. They wanted it to be clear, the welcome for children. And we talked about that, and they decided instead to use what they use in Britain yearly meeting, which is children's meeting. And since then, I know a couple of meetings who've adopted this language. My Westchester meeting is using it now. We took that decision to business meeting and talked about it there. And I just think the phrase children's meeting kind of denotes the idea that the children are in spiritual community when they're together in their program, as well as the idea that they're part of the big meeting as well. So just something to think about. Get down off my first day school soapbox now. So the takeaway here being, take a look at your website, look at your signage. It's the first thing people often see. It's the invitation. Information is welcome. If you can tell parents what to expect, they're more likely to come back again. When they cross that threshold, what comes next? Does the greeter have information about childcare or the youth religious ed program? Do they have something that they can hand to a visitor along with announcements and information about the meeting? Do you have the PYM programs calendar to hand to them? I really hope you do. If you don't, it's on the PYM website and you can print it out. It's a really pretty one right now with circles that talks about what we're up to in the youth programs across the yearly meeting. Print out a few copies or send it to families in your meeting. Is there, when we're back in meeting houses, is there a table with information about programs and calendars and how this works in your meeting? Again, people want to be able to answer the question, how will this work for our family if we come here? They want to feel that sense. If you can make them feel that they can belong there, that's really important to community building. The little book Quaker Meeting and Me is shown here. This was a project of the Quaker Religious Education Collaborative a few years ago. It was a Britain Yearly Meeting thing, and the artist agreed to work with us to change the artwork so that there were children who were clearly people of color in the story, in the art. So I have some more copies of these. It's just a little book about what Quaker Meeting is. It's very sweet, and you can actually print a PDF of it from the QREC website as well. And I think it's being reprinted for us all to have more copies. So the other side, that's just the one from my meeting, but it's nice to have something that really lays out for families what to expect, what happens with childcare. My favorite part of this handout is the bottom, where it talks about the other times that parents are responsible for their children at meeting when their kids are, I remember being a child running around at meeting and playing underneath benches in the meeting room. So, some clarity about what to expect, what happens, what the community is up to, and how they care for their children. It's a nice thing to be able to hand out. I'm not going to read all these because I am going to share the slides with you, but just to say that schedules and spaces is another nuts and bolts piece. And again, I really want to recognize, like I said at the beginning, I may be like stretching way out here with a vision of how we might try to do things differently. It doesn't mean that we all need to start doing it this differently next week. I just want you to think about where on the continuum there might be a step in a direction like this. So it's really important to think about things like, when are groups and committees meeting? Are they happening at family-friendly times? If there are enough families in your meeting that you want to have them participating on committees and in the work of the meeting, ask when is a good time for them. Find out from them as well what might work. We tried an experiment at Westchester meeting with our meeting for business. Our meeting for business was small. We have it at noon, like right after meeting on the second Sunday of the month. And we tried an experiment. Youth Religious Education Committee brought forward a question: could we try having meeting for business at 9 in the morning, have breakfast? I mean, something simple, boxes of donuts or bagels. Our childcare person came early at 9 o'clock. And so if we set up a situation where there was food, you could say to your kids, get in the car, breakfast is there when we get there. You'll get breakfast when we get there. If we had food and childcare, would more people who were second, thirds, those parents, people who are parenting, would they come and participate in our meeting for business? And they did. We doubled the size of the number of people who were in meeting for business. You get to noon and families on a Sunday often have other places they need to be, and people or kids are melting down and need lunch or naps. So we were trying to think about what's the time that might work. It's just an example. Wellesley meeting in New England realized they had shrunk so much in terms of families and children there. This was a few years ago. They tried something they called all ages religious education. And they started with breakfast. It was bigger, and then it got kind of more like a box of donuts, but they always had breakfast there. And doesn't have to be fancy. And then they had about 20 minutes of all ages together for something in that morning, in the hour before worship, or the 45 minutes before their worship began. So they spent part of the time all together, 15 minutes either reading a story, hearing a godly play or faith and play story, having a presentation from someone. And then the children went to their program, and the adults stayed for their adult RE conversation, an extension maybe of what they'd just done. And then during meeting for worship, everybody could come to meeting for worship. They also had what they called friendly playground, and there was a babysitter who then was there if children wanted to go play. But some children chose to come to worship, and all the parents could come to worship, and all the people who were teaching their children's programs could come to worship. And we know, if you've ever been someone who's teaching in a first day program, you're often not in meeting because you're with the children. So there's lots of different ways to be creative in that way, but it does require us to think about our time a little differently than how we may have always done it. So it's a little bit about turning the sock inside out. in that way, and really thinking about things in a flipped way or slightly differently, and to what degree you're willing to have that flexibility in order to have that welcome. So I actually did a workshop this summer at FGC Gathering that I also called All Together Now. And the premise was, what if everything a meeting did, well, you can hold on to your hats because I'm about to turn the sock really inside out. What if everything a meeting did centered the needs of the families in their meeting first? So the times of worship, where worship was, what the space was like, times for committee meetings and meeting for business. We just sort of explored what would that all look like. And we explored the places where that might not work, where there's resistance, where there's reasonable resistance. And yet it was really fun to think about how might that look. And it doesn't mean that you have to do all the things, but is there like one thing that might be a move that might really be welcoming and opening in that way? And I think the other thing to say about second thirds, this 35 to 55-ish group, is that they may be parenting, they may be working people, they may be kind of really in the thick of a professional life. They're often toward the end of the second thirds time, they may have elder care, they may have older parents who they're also helping to support. These are people who need pastoral care. These are people who, if we're not seeing them, we should be checking in on them. They are people who are often being, all stages of life have challenges. These folks are stretched really thin. And then, however, that does not mean that you should assume that they don't want to be on committees. I get actually a little upset when I hear people say, well, we could ask her, but she works and she has kids. Let her decide if this is how she wants to serve, if this is how she wants to use her time, whoever she or he is. Don't make those assumptions, but be sensitive to the concern and to the need for pastoral care. And I know many of you are. I know I'm preaching to the choir about some of this. There's some other things on here about spaces. Just thinking about how a space in a meeting really gives unspoken, immediate clues to a family about how prepared we are to welcome them. My meeting has a lot of antique horsehair furniture. I don't know if yours do too. Like old furniture, like lovely upholstered furniture. And for years, I would put my little people with their cup of juice on this furniture and just sort of stand there hovering over them, waiting for disaster to strike. And at one point, I don't remember whose idea, it was probably my 5-year-old daughter's idea. We thought maybe we could have a little table and chairs in our social room, in our, where we have coffee hour. And I remember we went to IKEA and there was a blue table and red chairs, and Ellie was scandalized. She was like, is it okay to have a blue table and red chairs at meeting? But we thought it was. And so we put it in our room where our coffee hour is, the social room. And it was transformative. The children could all sit around the table and have their juice and cookies, and they could spill things. And moreover, the more important part, it was very sweet watching them sit together and chat. They had their own coffee hour. But more importantly, their parents were able to talk to other adults. People like me who had been like hovering over them could go and have an adult conversation because they were in an appropriate space for them to sit and have their own coffee hour. So being able to be in community with other parents and other members of the meeting, other people who I didn't get to talk to very often, it was really, for a lot of us who were parents, it was pretty transformative. A silly thing, a table and chairs. Thinking about things for children to support them if they want to be in worship. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. And there's more about this on the PYM website as well. There are a couple of documents about friendly spaces for families. Some of which I'll give another New York Yearly Meeting shout out. Some of which is developed from the work of an excellent work of an outreach committee in New York Yearly Meeting. So there are other questions here, and again, you're going to get these slides. I guess the one other thing I want to say, and not reading the slide, is to think about your spaces and anti-racism work. And I will out my own meeting here, and they would not be surprised because we've had this conversation. Our social room, the walls, all have paintings that are very Quaker history focused, but they're all like white people from the 17 and 1800s. Like I really appreciate the Elizabeth Fry painting. It's beautiful, but we also have Fox and we have a couple of other, like, think about if you walk into that room, what are the unspoken messages? It's all looking back at our past, and they're all white faces on the walls. And we've talked about, we actually are sharing our social room right now with Westchester Friends School for them to do their COVID mitigation and spread out. But when we go back in there, let's not just redo the floors. Let's think about what's on the walls. Our meeting, our school was where Bayard Rustin's grandmother went to school. Bayard Rustin was from Westchester. Horace Pippin is a wonderful Black artist who's from Westchester. Why do we not have a piece of art of his on the wall? So thinking about how the books on our shelves, what's on our walls, who does it say about who we are in our welcome, and that opportunity that's there. So can friends see the queries I put in the chat? I think because we were all here, it should be there. Do you see that in the chat? I can put it in again. No? All right, hold on. Let me try putting them in again. Now do you see them? They should be the most recent thing in the chat. I'll read them. In what ways do you best experience hospitality, and how does that create welcome for you? What are some things you've noticed about your own experience of hospitality and feeling welcomed? Does the experience of inclusion happen differently for people of various ages and stages of life? So does inclusion look different or feel different if you're 5, if you're 25, if you're 65? Look, I skipped second thirds if you're 45. And what are the spoken and unspoken messages of welcome in your own meeting? If you think about your own meeting, I'm willing to share about that too. All right, so we'll do this until 8:00. It's 7:50 now, so it's not a lot of time. You don't have to go through all 3 queries. The queries are just to get your juices flowing and thinking about. You may have things you want to respond to from the first part of what was presented, but these queries are to just to get you going. Is that okay? Are we good with that plan?
No, we want you in our groups.
Oh.
Can you float a minute here? Can you float a minute here and a minute there?
I don't know. I can go and I can see if I can pop into them. I don't know. We'll find out. I'm hoping we have some time for Q&A at the end as well. So I just wanted to give people an opportunity to talk in smaller groups. It just felt like that was good energy to have together. All right. Welcome back, friends. So we're gonna have some time at the end before we close to make sure we have some time to talk all together. I wonder if there are things that rose for you in the conversation. If you might type them in the chat to everybody, a phrase or an observation, something that was shared in your group. If you might put it in the chat, that way we'll also have captured it.
Well, one of the things that we talked about is when we do get people coming in the door for the first time, and so one of the things that had happened to us is they came in the door for the first time, and that was the last time too. And I think what we discussed was sometimes you don't want to seem too eager and too overly friendly to the point where you actually scare people. We're a very small meeting, and we only have maybe about between 5, 6, 7 people, even pre-pandemic. So, sometimes that can scare people off that we are desperate for membership, and, we don't want to scare people off like that. Mm-hmm. But I think Emma, in our breakout group, Emma suggested that there should be a point person that, and they could be like the liaison or the kind of someone that talks to, be a friend instead of everybody talking with this new group, or maybe it could be a mother, daughter, or whoever, husband and wife, whoever's coming to the meeting first, kind of a liaison where that person's appointed to kind of show them the ropes and what we do. And, instead of everybody bombarding them, kind of have one person, a very calm voice, a very friendly voice, to kind of, invite them and make it warm and something that they want to come back to.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I thought that was a great idea.
Well, the flip side of that idea was that nobody would get ignored if they come into a meeting and social hour, to make sure that there was some sort of contact.
Nice. Thank you both. That's great. And I'm going to get to Arlene's comment in the chat too. We once went to a new meeting, and I had my 3 children who have been raised in meeting in tow, and we walked in with our 3 kids, and people were like, and when we left, one of my kids said, "Wow, if we weren't already Quakers, that would have been really scary." And I was like, but they thought they got it. They understood. It's that balance. And I think too, like, it's a wonderful idea to have a point person, someone who is really warm and will make people feel welcome. Also to have something to hand them to take home with them, whether it's a copy of Quaker Meeting and Me, or, something that says children are welcome here in some way. I actually have a thing that that New England friends made. It's like a little fold over. It's just a piece of paper you can fold in half, and it says, and if you email me and ask me, I will tailor it to your meeting and put your meeting's name and your meeting's website and your meeting's address and the time of worship on it. I don't have it open, but I can quickly screen share it. But it has a couple things to color and a little labyrinth in it. And it's just something that you can hand to a family that a child can color while they're there. And then they take it home with them, and they have the time of worship and your website and how to find you. And it's a little bit of a hook, a tether, a connection for them to take home, and kind of feel like maybe they want to come back again. Because you're right. I think that coming once and then not being sure is a thing. We're going to try something. I'm not sure how it'll now be impacted by COVID. We wanted to try at our meeting the idea of having coffee hour, and I'm going to turn the sock inside out again, having coffee hour before worship. What if we had coffee and, whatever, something simple. People could come and have hospitality for even 15 or 20 minutes before worship. How would it change the experience of being a visitor and going into worship if you'd already had some fellowship? If people knew your name, if you went into meeting for worship having had a conversation with somebody, feeling welcomed. A lot of times visitors come into a silent room and, they probably have some idea why we're sitting, and they probably aren't like, why is it not started yet or whatever. But again, how would it change how it feels to go into meeting for worship? Even for those of us in our own meeting, how would a short period of fellowship change our sense of community and feeling that connection to each other before we sit down to worship together? We proposed this and everyone was like, that's a great idea. Can we please also have coffee hour after meeting? So our poor fellowship committee was like, yeah, maybe we'll just leave the stuff out for later. But it's just another way of thinking about it differently. Arlene has written in the chat, and this is, that COVID has reversed some of the progress in terms of religious education and families and making that connection with them. That Zoom has really been challenging for families. We really did reach a point where, especially if kids were in school and doing online school, it was really hard to try to imagine being there again on on a Sunday morning. So I know Chatham Summit has done really good work with including things and doing intergenerational parts. So how to stay connected even in this time, it's more challenging. And actually, Josh and I were talking during the break that this fall is not what any of us thought it was going to be. We all, I think, thought we were going to come back together in ways that we're not. So we, continuing to think about how to stay connected. I mean, you all know this, but phone calls and outreach and reaching out to people, letting them know, no pressure, that we're there for them is so important. Carlton, thank you. The most important hospitality comes from people. Friends have a familiarity with one another. It can be difficult for a brand new person, try to blend the usual discussion with introductions. That is so important. There's a meeting in another yearly meeting where they talk about queuing up, that after meeting, everyone zooms to find the person they need to talk to about a committee. Or they, everybody kind of like, jumps into their clumps of people who need to talk about something they need to. I mean, I've done that. I have like a stack of things after meeting and I know who I need to talk to. How do you make sure that might need to happen, but that visitor, to your point, is not standing there alone with no one talking to them. So balancing like the times that we need to be connecting with each other with new people as well. Yeah, and thanks, Arlene. FGC's materials for children that accompany the welcome handouts. Yes, I'll try to find that link to put in the chat. But yeah, there are, if you don't know, FGC has those wonderful, they're like bookmarks, right? They're like welcoming newcomers. And they developed an entire set of coloring sheets, and some of them are puzzles and word searches. My children actually did some of the testing them out for for the FGC folks who created them. I was like, does the word search work? And so they literally pair up with the FGC cards that are like the things you would hand to adults. They're things for children, and they're free. They're a free download off the FGC website. So thanks, Arlene. I'll see if I can find that link. Anything else? And I'm going to keep going with the slideshow, but anything else anyone wants to lift up from your small group discussions?
I'd just like to add another portion of when I was saying that blending usual discussion with introductions. I was also referring to things like first day school, where we'll have kind of a groove that our usual group gets to. And so we'll try and continue doing that, and also try and introduce a new person. And it can be a little bit difficult to blend the two. So.
Yeah, thanks for naming that, Carlton. Thank you. All right, can I go? We'll go back to the next part, and then it's shorter, and then we can have some conversation all together again. So I call this slide the slide that would not exist without COVID-19. Thank you very much, COVID-19. I would not have needed it, but I think it is an open door and an invitation in a way. So we continue to be in this place of disruption. And I appreciate Arlene lifting that up in the chat and that sharing. This disruption in our usual way of doing things. So in this sort of continued destabilized place, where does the light get in? And what are the opportunities and the possibilities in this liminal place? Could we see ourselves instead as standing on a threshold to something new on the other side? And this is where I'm going to stretch us again here and keep messing with the sock, that how can we rethink some of our structures and our practices? I wonder about this both to support who is in our meeting now, and also to support who might come in the future. In liminal spaces, we're back to that threshold but those liminal thresholds are where transformation happens, and we can step into something new. We continue to be in online spaces or in hybrid spaces now. We continue to need to try to do religious education, in different ways. At my meeting, we're blessed to have 2 lovely porches. And so we're doing with our children porch programs. We're sitting outside through November, and then we'll see where we are. Everyone's going to have to wear their winter coat. So how do we keep thinking about that? And I guess I want to name too, and I think this is really important, that I think it's important, especially if you're folks who are supporting children in your meeting and children and families and programming, that there is real grief in this. I think it's okay to name that grief, and to go ahead and name the feeling of that. It is a little scary. And who have we not seen in months, because it's just been really hard with Zoom and with school and with life and with fear and anxiety around COVID. how there's real grief about change in our relationships and our community and how we do things. And so I think you can't move beyond that until you've named it. So I want to just go ahead and let us do that. And the time beyond COVID, at whatever point we feel we're more beyond it, it may look different in our meetings. We were already beginning to see that with some of the hybrid choices that some meetings are making. So what can be supported and envisioned now, and what might sustain us in a new place too? And how do we keep staying tethered to families, connected to them? So I sometimes think about this. I just wanted an excuse to put a chicken in the slides, really. But I have 6 hens. They were my pandemic project at our house. 6 chicks was a really cute idea. And then they became 6 chickens. And now they lay 6 eggs a day. And I don't know what to do with all their eggs. So there you go. That's why they're showing up here. There's a little bit of a chicken egg nature of children and families in meetings. What comes first? Is it that the families come and then there's a program, or is it the program being ready for them? Do programs draw families, or do we wait to create programs when families come to our meeting? It feels like this cycle that we sometimes wonder about. And I sometimes get the question, well, what do we do to be ready if families come? We don't have families now. What do we do to be ready? And what I want people to think about, and in terms of being family friendly, what I'd like to suggest we think about is the thing that we already have. So if there's no family community to join, what do we say to people that we have there? If there's no peer group for their kids, and often having peers and having friends at meeting is a big connection for children. But if there are no children currently, there is no program, what is that thing? So I think the thing we have is worship. I think the thing we already have that's there is worship. And so the big question then becomes, how can we welcome families in worship more inclusively? And I know that this is a stretch in some ways. So for a meeting without a children's program, how do you create a space for children to be in worship with their family if they come across the threshold into your meeting? And for a meeting with a children's program, how can we reimagine children being in worship? Because it's an invitation to being in community together. It's an invitation to practice our faith together across generations. And it's an invitation to lifelong spiritual growth. And thinking about the idea of all ages worship. So in this liminal threshold place, that's the invitation. It's not the only thing that we can do, but it's an anchor that the rest of what happens for children and families in a meeting might be tethered to. And how do we make that work for them? So I have lots of resources on how to do all ages worship in a meeting, and what kinds of things to provide to support children being in unprogrammed worship. I mean, that's really the question. People say, well, kids are not going to sit still for an hour in meeting. And no, they're not. Even Obadiah didn't in the very cute Obadiah books. But I really want us to focus on the idea of change for us in meetings and what that might look like. So right now, many of us are using Zoom or have that space available. That allows families to join from home. How might we invite families to join us even there? And think about, it's okay for kids to move in and out. It's okay for them to have a snack. It's okay for there to be some books there. How might we invite them to be with us? We need connection to each other. How do we make that connection? This is the family corner in our meeting house at Westchester. This just happened in the last couple of months. We had done an entire project about handicap accessibility. And then the people who had been on that project, one of them came to me and said, what would happen if we made a space in our meeting room, in the worship room, for families and children? I said, well, I don't know. Like, what do you think it might look like? And the person, and I'll just name that this is somebody who does not have children. It's an older friend who does not have children of their own. which made it all the more tender in my mind. He said, well, what if we had like a rocking chair and a little table and like a rug and like some things that if a family came with little children and they were too little or didn't want to go to the children's program, that they could stay in the meeting room with their parents. And so that's what we did. We moved other things out and we put down a rug and we got a rocking chair and a little table and chairs. There's a basket of books there. There's some different pillows now, but there's some pillows. That's the little "You Are Welcome Here" coloring thing on the table. And the best part was when we were standing there looking at it after it had all been accomplished, and he looked at me and he said, you know, if nobody ever uses it, but if people walk into our meeting house and see it there and know, and they see that we really want children to come here and be here, then it'll be worth it that we did this. And that was when I started to cry. But it really was, it's a message. It's there, and it's a message. And it can be so simple, but thinking about, is it possible to create a quiet space like that? To create a place that says, you are welcome here in this space with us. You belong, and it comes back to belonging. You belong here. And, you know, there's no perfect or right way to do this. Meetings can support children coming, as I said, on Zoom. There's a little more on this slide about doing that. We put it right in our announcements. Come to meeting on Zoom. This is when we were in lockdown, really. Bring a snack, bring things you want. You can move in and out. Reassure parents it's okay for their kids to do that. There's the beauty of mute. And we had a number of families where children would stay on the couch and read or color, but stay close by. And there was a sense that we were together, even there in our Zoom boxes in that way. We've also, when we're able to physically be together, experimented with what we call community worship. And we actually, I know there's some schools in New Jersey, or some meetings that are in care relationships with schools. We invite the school at least once a year to come. And the thing on the right is just an example of how we prepared everyone of what community worship was going to look like. In community worship, we put quilts down on the floor in the middle of the meeting room, and we have pipe cleaners. They are so quiet, those pipe cleaners, and crayons and coloring. I've learned not to use markers. Markers make a whole lot of noise. I learned that the hard way. But quiet things and a basket of books. And we often begin with something, either singing together or a story, and then we settle into worship. And the kids do scooch around, and they find a book and they realize they want a different book. And some children stay in the benches with their parents and they come over to get some pipe cleaners and go back. So they're walking through the room quietly, silently. And there's some adults who come and sit on the floor on the quilts with us on the floor. But there's this moment, friends, where it's like downshifting. There's this moment where suddenly we get still, like really still. And maybe some kids are quietly coloring or reading or laying down on the floor, but we're all together. And the children stay for the whole time that we're in the meeting room together. We only do this a few times a year, but the sense of being together, and I'm probably the person I'm like the mother with the baby. I'm like most anxious that it's all going to go wrong. And there's just this wonderful moment where it does get quiet and we settle in together. So meetings trying to support this in whatever way it works for you with some intention. Even just with that invitation, we would love to see your children. Whether it's on Zoom or in the meeting, it's okay, whatever they need. It's that anchor and that tether. I'm not going to read all of this, but research has shown that children who do not worship with the body of whatever congregation they belong to and do not feel connected in that way to their spiritual community will leave in adulthood. Like, I'm not making it up. It's based on research. But congregations that are open to some change in their worship are the ones, and are willing to adapt, are the ones that grow. I don't know that we have a whole lot of evidence of this among friends, because I don't think we've done a whole lot of changing or adapting or making space for families and young people in this way. But we do know for other denominations it has been true. So working to balance the time in age-specific spaces with time in all ages spaces. They're both really valuable. I grew up in a family, on our family farm, where at Thanksgiving time or Christmas time, we would have family meals where there was a children's table. And we really looked forward to being with cousins and siblings and having our own conversation and our own space. We did not eat things like creamed pearl onions that the grown-ups were eating. And then there was the big table, where all the adults were, a couple generations of adults. And I think our children need both kinds of spaces. They do need children's meeting or first day school. They need their own spiritual community of their peers who they're learning with and trying on ideas and that idea of formation. And they also need the invitation to the big table, the invitation that there is a place for them in the meeting room. Maybe not every week, but on occasion, the idea that it is there for them too. Because as a child growing up, I think we all knew someday we were going to be the grown-ups at the big table in the dining room. And I really would love for our children to grow up with a sense in our meetings that someday they may be the grown-ups sitting at the big table. They will be the adults in worship. And it may or may not be the case. I have 3 children. I'm not sure if any of them are going to be practicing friends when they grow up. I hope so. But there's more for them to take away from that sense of belonging that is so important for them. So accompaniment and the shared understanding about why. Why do we want children and families? Why do we invite them? And if we know why, can it help us to shape how we do it? Can it help us to think about how we make a space a bigger circle, more inclusion in that way? How can we try to be all together and now and in the future? Again, our children are not just the future. They're not in only the future. They're part of our present. And so how to really gather around that table with them together. All right. Well, thanks for listening to all of that. I wonder if we want to open this up for some conversation together. Questions, observations, things that you'd like to share from your own experience. And I don't feel the need with this size of group. I think people can just unmute and go ahead and share.
Well, at Morristown, we did change to have a special table and chairs for the kids to. Mostly it was to keep them from running around the meeting room and imperil the elderly folks there. But the idea of a child-sized table did not occur to me. And using larger chairs and a larger table, the parents had to sort of supervise to make sure their toddlers didn't fall off the chairs. I think it's brilliant to have kid-sized furniture. We have that in our library, but not in the social room or the meeting room.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Great. Thanks, Emma.
Melinda, you mentioned a couple times that we as a community need to change some things about how we think. Maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, but that's kind of the gist I got. I might be projecting too, because these are feelings that I have had for a little while now. I'm curious about some of the pushback you might have gotten, some of these, blow your socks off ideas.
Well, I'll tell you my favorite one. My favorite pushback is about silence. And again, like, I feel like I'm being like, I'm like pushing it out there, and like everyone doesn't need to go all the way out there. I've actually heard people say, I really need that hour of silence on Sunday morning. And when it's a parent of really young children, that feels a little different to me, because meeting for worship may literally be the only time nobody's like physically on you or needing something from you. I mean, people who've parented small people will remember that stage of life. Josh, enjoy. But I worry that we have made an idol of silence among unprogrammed friends sometimes, and that it's not an hour of, I like to say George Fox never promised you an hour of silence. Like, George never stopped talking. I don't think he would preach at you for an hour or two. So, if we think about our unprogrammed worship as needing to be an hour of pristine silence, then it's going to be really hard to think about how to welcome children and young people into that space, right? I mean, it just sounds hard even to say it. But if we don't think about that hour as being one of, silent worship that will be interrupted. And by the way, grown-ups make so much noise in worship. Stop and listen to how much noise adults make sometime, like in the silence of worship. It's a lot of noise. We reach for a tissue, we blow our nose, we take something out of our bag, we move a book, whatever. We fall asleep and snore, who knows? But, if we can think about our worship, if we can reframe what we're doing as being a time of communal gathering for waiting worship, I think it makes a little more room for a scritchy little body, or a whisper in a parent's ear, or a book that gets dropped, or whatever it might be. And I also think about this in relation to rest, because I think sometimes when people say, I really need that hour of silence on Sunday morning, what they mean is, I need more rest. And so to me, that also makes me wonder, how are we not taking good enough care of each other, or checking on or checking our own needs? Do we come to meeting waiting for that time to be a time of rest for us? And are there other ways and places that we might create more space for rest, so that coming together and meeting is that time of communal gathering that makes a little more room for the possibility of, it being not entirely settled and silent. I mean, there is a stillness and a silence that we know is part of how we worship as friends. But I really do worry that if we don't make a little more room for some of this, if we don't make more room for young people, for children and their parents to feel included, I think we're in some trouble. So I don't know that that's exactly, that's one thing that I sometimes get pushed back on is, well, but it's, how can you even imagine children being part of unprogrammed worship? It doesn't work. And children also have a much higher capacity for silence than I think we think they do. And as someone who was a Friends school teacher for 20 years, I can tell you that that young people in Friends schools do a lot longer than 15 minutes. I think one place to turn the sock inside out is just to think about children coming back to meeting for a little longer sometimes. Kids in schools, even elementary school students in Friends schools who are not Quaker kids, will be in meeting for worship for 30 minutes, or 40 minutes if they're middle schoolers. And I think they need that too. I once had a middle schooler, a sixth grader, say to me, meeting for worship is the only time in my whole week that no one is asking anything of me. So there's that need as well. I am recognizing that it is 8:33. I've been monologuing. Josh, you asked me the wrong question. It was one I had too much passion about. And it's really time for us to be done. Is there anything that needs to be said or asked that we didn't make room for? I'm sorry. Yeah, Cindy.
I wanted to say that I found the best outreach in principle is to have fun things for families to jump into. And like tricorder, when we do tricorder gathering, I encourage people to invite their non-Quaker friends, because when they come in, they get they get immediate participation, immediate contacts with the kids, they immediately are pulled into the group as a community. And there's so many different activities that they find things they like. And I feel like that has been almost the best way to get people to come to your meeting, is to invite, get people to come to Tricorder. They get by osmosis what Quakers are about. And then they say, oh, you're not Puritans, you're not the Amish, okay, So I don't know if we can duplicate that in other ways, have a way to have activities that are open, that people can bring people to.
Yeah, unpack that. What are the things about Tricorder, and then how, exactly as you said, how is that reproducible in some other way in other times as well? Yeah. This is at least the second or third time I've been to something related to Tricorder where people have talked about just what an amazing opportunity for community and gathering it is. So there you go. All right. Well, I'm sorry to have kept us longer than we were supposed to be here this evening. Thank you for the time, everybody.
Thank you, Melinda. It's wonderful.
Thank
You did
you.
an okay job.
Thank you.
It was all right.
Thanks, Josh.
Thank you.